since the blood of the Snow Country imperial family was mixed with the blood of the water spirit. When their heart is filled with sorrow, the sky is covered with clouds and it starts to rain. And then the protagonist in mourning clothes looked up at the sky and saw that there wasn't a single cloud in the sky. Then turned her attention to the emperor, who stated that the prince must bid the empress farewell for the last time. And he calmly agreed. And then looking at him, the protagonist thought that the empress was his mother. And the girl didn't realize how much emotion he was holding back since he could cheat even the weather. But the protagonist knew that her brother had always been not particularly emotional. But still, even so, it rained heavily. And so the girl looking at her brother wondered how hard it was for him. But at that moment, her mother came to her and calmed the protagonist by telling her that she had an umbrella, so she didn't have to worry about getting wet. But she was completely unresponsive to her words and slowly began to lose consciousness. And all she could see was the worried people gathered around trying to help her and called a doctor to bring her back to consciousness. Nishin had drenched clothes and black-clad men around her, but her brother's eyes were filled not with sadness but with rage. It was at that moment that the girl finally realized that this world was part of the novel. The Empire of Snow is a place blessed by the spirits, and in this empire, the 24th Emperor Dagon Royce Arthur Whitesnow has already ruled, as well as a princess of the Rain Kingdom. And as a result of this union, Prince Aiden Henry was born. But despite this, Emperor Dagon Royce Arthur Whitesnow paid no attention to her consort or her own native son. And that was until Melissa, a common aristocrat, won his heart. Eventually, the lovesick Emperor Dagon Royce Arthur Whitesnow decided that this girl would be the true empress for him. And then their child was born, whose name was Nishina Aaron. She had hair as black as tar, smooth white skin and eyes as blue as the sky, was a girl who inherited the traits of the imperial family and was dubbed the treasure of the empire, a beauty raised in unconditional love. And she was almost of age, so she could make a contract with the water spirit. And recognizing her abilities and sweet character, it was the princess who was proclaimed the little son of the empire. And everyone just said that the future of this girl is clearly bound to be beautiful. But it all came to an end when the rebels began to be listened to. And eventually the prince killed the emperor and his minions with the support of his mother's family. And the princess was banished to the most unholy of lands. And in exile, she secretly treated people who needed it, and the girl was going to live so quietly until her death. But the saint's name became more and more famous, as did her abilities. So the prince saw his sister as a threat and ordered his most loyal knight, Rubus, to kill the woman. Nishina Aaron saw Rubus rustle and said that her brother had probably already given the order if the knight had appeared in this place. And so she humbly fell to her knees, thinking that now her life was truly over. But Rubus Russell calmly announced that he was giving the protagonist a chance to speak before she died. But she only pondered that her last words would likely be passed on to her brother and wondered what she wanted to tell him. So with a smile, she conveyed that she very much hoped that Aiden Henry would be the sun that shines even in the farthest reaches of the empire. And so the much-loved princess died, leaving only the prince alive to take the bloodstained throne. He was endowed with the traits of the strong emperor he wished to be, but in return, he lost all remaining human feelings. And when it seemed his whole life was filled with misery, a girl appeared who changed his life dramatically, and Aiden Henry considered her his savior. And that was the end of their story. In a story called Snow White, the main character wasn't Nishina Aaron, but eventually when she opened her eyes, she saw a crying, worried maid who was trying to bring the girl back to consciousness. The main character did not understand how she was here, and then frightened Joey crying explained that Nishina Aaron fainted, and so they took her to the room. And the maid asked the girl to rest, because if she got worse, they were sure to call a doctor. But she quietly rose from her seat when she was alone in a room, pondering that if her dream was real, it meant she would die soon. And just thinking about it made her body shiver, because she didn't want to die like that. But afterwards, she remembered that even her parents would have to die at the hands of her older brother, and she wasn't going to let that happen, because there had to be some way to make sure no one died and her brother was happy. Nishina Aaron in the novel had no hard feelings and regrets, and she accepted the tragic end alone. And so when the protagonist remembered, she could come up with a plan because she understood her brother's behavior. As she had caused Aiden incredible pain by her mere existence, and her happiness was the cause of his loneliness. And Nishina Eren understood this, but decided not to pay any attention because she was afraid of being rejected as well. And eventually, all of those moments gradually turned into real hatred, and she remained an enemy to her own brother until the very end. But the girl knew that such a horrible future should not happen, and so Nishina Eren decided that she should make sure that everyone was happy at the end of the story. But the maid who entered was very displeased that Nishina Eren was awake, for she was supposed to be resting in bed. But the protagonist awkwardly tried to make excuses, but realizing it was futile, agreed to just lie down like Joey had asked her to do. But before she did, she asked how the Empress funeral had gone. But Joey calmly explained that the funeral had ended almost as soon as the princess had passed out. And a frightened Nishina Eren did not understand the reason, for the funeral was to go on. But the maid calmly said that it was the emperor's order, for the treasure of their empire was more important than any funeral. And so Joey asked Nishina Eren not to worry about anything and just get a good night's rest. But she shockingly realized that things had already gone wrong, and so she pondered the fact that she might die even sooner than in the original novel. In the end, no matter how much Nishina Eren pondered, only a few ideas came to her mind. The first is that Emperor Dagon Royce Arthur Whitesnow should have made Aiden his successor. Secondly, she needed to ease her brother's hatred of her by any means necessary. And these first steps were on the way to change the future. But the protagonist in despair thought that if these points were at all possible, she would not have died then. But even if she told Aiden she wasn't worried about the throne, there's no guarantee her brother would believe her, much less the choice of an heir was the king's right, and he was extremely selective. And in the end, to convince him, it is necessary to redirect the force supporting the princess to the prince. But this obviously could not be done abruptly, especially since now she will not be able to get closer to her brother, because she's the one who recently ruined his mother's funeral. But as soon as the image she'd seen that day popped into her head, her courage vanished. And that left her with a third plan, which was Ruba's Russell, because she had to make sure the knight didn't kill her, but let her go. And there was no point in sending this fellow off somewhere and interfering with his and Aiden's meeting, for Aiden Henry could have ordered the same thing to any other knight. And so it was best to keep Ruba's Russell close and watch him. But she needed to think of some plan to make sure the guy would definitely let her go. Because if the order was given, any knight would not hesitate to bear his own against her. And so Nishina Eren already realized that there was no easy way out of the situation. And once it seemed that the protagonist of this story was her, but black as tar hair, deep as sea blue eyes, and white as snow skin were not characteristics that belonged only to her. And so too, Nishina Eren realized that even if she wasn't the protagonist of the story, she needed to change the future from her memories. And you'll have to be sure to get the silver-haired knight to favor her so he can't kill her in the future. Like that hunter from Snow White who in the original fairy tale took pity on the girl and couldn't kill her. And then Nishina Eren realized that in that case, she should become like Snow White herself. Ended up going to lunch a little later with Nishina Eren with her parents, who were very concerned about her condition. But she calmly reported that she was indeed fine. And excitedly, Emperor Dagon Royce Arthur Whitesnow reflected on the words of the healer and stated that Nishina Eren's illness was not that dangerous, but she should still keep an eye on her health. But she convinced her father that it was because she'd been reading late at night a lot lately, and maybe it was sleep deprivation. But Nishina Eren admitted that she wanted to discuss something with her father, even though she knew he had a lot of string political things to do. But Emperor Dagon Royce Arthur Whitesnow looked at his daughter with a pleased smile and stated that he had nothing more important to do than his own daughter. But the protagonist knew that the matter was really urgent, for she had seen the tears of the Emperor's aide, and so she didn't know how to discuss it with her father. But the next moment, Melissa turned to her daughter and stated that apparently the main character was still bad, and suggested she try chicken boiled in broth with herbal remedies, for she had heard that in the East, it was eaten for recuperation. And so Nishina Eren realized that she obviously shouldn't argue with her worried mother, and so she agreed, at the thought that it looked like she could use this situation to her advantage, and stated that she would need to start training her stamina and admitted that she wanted to learn how to wield a sword, because even though she won't become an outstanding swordsman, it would definitely help her improve her health. While she thought that only through her studies would she have a chance to bond with Rubus, and then reflecting Emperor Dagon Royce Arthur Whitesnow stated that care for health and body are very important qualities for a future successor. And so turning to his knight stated that he would instruct his daughter in the art of wielding the ball. But at this moment, Nishina Eren resolutely stated that although she considered Sir Hilton to be a very strong knight, It was impossible to waste his time training her, after which they argued for a while and agreed that Emperor Dagon Royce Arthur Whitesnow would find a suitable teacher for his daughter. But she calmly stated that the other knights were also busy protecting the empire and the imperial family, so she didn't want to disturb them for personal reasons. And then I realized that Rubus Russell was technically a knight at 17, and because of his extraordinary skills, he was able to get into the palace in just 1 year, which means he's not a knight yet. He's just being trained. Stated that she would be best suited for a knight candidate who is still in training, for she believed that the apprentices being trained had enough skills to train her, and they were better suited for further battles. And besides, Emperor Dagon Royce Arthur Whitesnow has always asked her to make friends, and if she gets close to any of the knight candidates, she can make friends with them. But the Emperor still tried to argue with Nishina, so she used her secret tactics that Emperor Dagon Royce Arthur Whitesnow couldn't resist. And agreeing, he stated that if Nishin didn't have some result, after a month, Knight Hilton would be her teacher. And Nishina Aaron only thanked her father happily for such a decision. Then it immediately turned to the knight and asked him to go to the training ground. Eventually, sometime later, Nishina Aaron was prepared for her to go out, and the maids really took a long time to take care of her image, despite the fact that she didn't seem to need it. And then Nishina Aaron admitted to Hilton that she was actually a little worried because she had taken snacks for the knight candidates, but she thought it was better to make a pie instead of cookies and muffins. But Hilton calmly informed them that since it was prepared by the princess, they would like even flour. But unhappy with such remarks, Nishina Aaron only reminded her that she was going to give a similar gift to her future teacher, and thought that Hilton didn't even realize the gravity of the situation. Well, the next moment they happened to cross paths with the prince. And then excitedly looking around him, Nishina Aaron realized that the man in front of her was the man who had ordered Rubus to kill her, as well as her only brother. And then ritualizing it, she wondered that Aiden Henry looked even more haggard than she had previously thought, and wondered if he had been eating well all this time. But he passed by without paying any attention to her. And so taking him by the sleeve, the girl asked him to stop. Aiden Heinrich was madly displeased. And then looking at Nishin's murderous gaze, Aaron thought that now she couldn't say a word. But the prince repeated his question again, and then the girl wondered what she could have said. For what she really wanted was to apologize for her mother taking the place of the empress. But in the end, she couldn't say anything to him, and so Aiden Heinrich just left. And Hilton immediately noticed Nishin's reaction and was very excited. But she only asked sadly if her brother would consider her consolation a mockery of him. But I knew I shouldn't bother everyone around me with something like that. So she just smiled and motioned for the knight to move on. Eventually, so they reached a training field, and then the knight explained that it was a training ground for cadets, and they lived here in groups and concentrated only on training, and stated that perhaps the cadets might feel some discomfort about living together, as almost all the young men here were aristocrats, but it might clearly increase their fraternal spirit, so it was necessary. But Hilton noticed that the girl was obviously looking for someone and stated that as a mentor of these guys, he could help the princess. But the next moment, Nishina Aaron handled herself and finally found the Rubus Russell boyfriend she needed. And then when he came back to them, and to her she was embarrassed to think that Rubus Russell was really a very handsome fellow. He had dazzling silver hair with red eyes showing through it, and it was exactly like seeing a rose blooming in the snow. But then she remembered that Rubus Russell's red eyes had spent his whole life trying to cure them because they were considered a symbol of the devil. And it's not known if this superstition is true, but it was believed by people all over the empire. And that's the kind of child the Earl's second son was born with. And what made it worse was that his mother, a servant girl, died after a difficult birth. And the rumor spread that Rubus Russell allegedly ate his mother from the inside out during childbirth. And so the boy grew up all alone. And the terrible time he lived through that made Rubus Russell the man he was now. And he became the one who bows his head to everyone. But in the next moment, Wave Nishina Aaron realized that she was now beginning to sympathize with Rubus, which was strange, for he was a man who had not hesitated to kill her. But she was distracted from her thoughts by a knight who ran up and apologized for being late. But Nishina Aaron only calmly informed her that there was nothing strange about it, as she was an uninvited guest. But to compensate for her sudden arrival, she prepared snacks. And then the joyful man immediately informed all the trainees that he was announcing a break, and stated that the princess made the candy herself and asked us to take turns. But after he had distributed sweets to his wards, he wondered why the princess had come, and Knight Hilton wanted to explain the whole situation himself. And then excitedly, the girl looked around Rubus Russell, wondered for what reason he had not eaten the sweets prepared for her, and was very anxious and hoped that he would not throw them away. But he ended up tasting all the cookies she made, which made Nishina Aaron insanely happy. But then the knight approached her and she explained to him that she would like to choose a strength training mentor among her students. And so she wished to hear the knight's recommendation for a capable cadet and thought that she should recommend Rubus, for he was the most capable of all the cadets. But to Nishin Aaron's surprise, she was offered Henry and was told that he was really capable and had a calm character, and so he wouldn't be much of a problem. But she explained again that she needed the best one of all, for she wanted to learn how to spar with knights. And then thinking, the knight confessed that as far as skill was concerned, Rubus Russell would be their best. And then the guy immediately thought about the fact that he was definitely not going to be picked, so bowed his head and started to walk away. But to his great surprise, the girl declared that she really liked him, and with a smile informed him that she wanted Rubus Russell to be the one to be her teacher. But in her head, she had already pictured a picture of the young man denying her request to become a teacher, and so she was very anxious as to what he would answer. But at that moment, a knight called to him and asked Rubus Russell to come nearer. And all the cadets around didn't understand why the princess chose him, because everyone thought the guy was cursed. But when he approached, he bowed to Nishina and greeted her and introduced himself. And she just happily informed me that she was insanely happy to finally meet him. And then the knight responsible for training the boys explained that the princess wanted to take Rubus as her teacher. But looking at Rubus Russell, the protagonist thought that it seems that the young man was very embarrassed by such a request. But it was the only opportunity to connect with him, and she hoped he would agree. But when the guy started talking, Nishina Aaron already thought he would say no. And so she excitedly explained that it would definitely not take him long and begged him to agree. And finally, he couldn't handle her pressure and agreed. And insanely happy with his answer, Nishina Aaron thanked him profusely for agreeing to work with her. And herself reflected that she had succeeded in carrying out part of the plan, and all that was left was to befriend him. Then she was sent to a class where the teacher told her that the empire where Nishina Aaron lived was the richest and most powerful empire on the continent. And it was through the protection of the spirits that the empire reached a calm and peaceful time. It was David who was the secretary of the imperial family, and now the teacher of the prince and princess. And then Nishina Aaron reflected that she had previously thought that the Wind Empire that bordered them was powerful just in terms of strength, something David was very unhappy about, and stated that knowledge of other countries is the foundation for a future ruler, and noted that Aiden Henry was clearly ahead of Nishina in this knowledge. But she only awkwardly wondered if she wasn't really motivated by the competition because she'd never been interested in it. But looking at the look on her face, David calmly decided to move on to another topic and explained that he wanted to discuss the cause of the degradation of the Wind Empire's lands, which had been going on for 200 years. But they knew that more than half of the current western territories of the Wind Empire had become the land of death. It was because of such a phenomenon that the Wind Empire was experiencing food shortages. And for this reason, they sought the Spirit Forest, which was on the border with their empire. But after apologizing, the protagonist remarked that she found the Wind Empire's tendency to do so strange. After all, the Wind Empire already owned part of the forest. But David explained that that part was quite small compared to the share their state owned, because the land they own won't solve the food shortage. And so robbers born in hunger have been crossing the border. And recently, there's even been a case of a crossing through a neighboring kingdom. But the princess restlessly inquired whether the people who were near the border and residing were all right. But David remarked with a smile that he could not accurately report whether they were all right. But the guardians of the empire worked hard to maintain and protect the public safety. And he stated that in all territories, there were their cronies who protected these lands. And among them were families like the Scopes, the Campbells, the Cavendashes. And then Nishina Aaron added that one of the families that defended their borders was also the Russell family. But David noticed that 2 years ago, in the war with the marauders on the frontier, if the second son of the family had not been active, he would have been immediately stripped of his title, and asked if Nishina Aaron knew the nickname that Rubus Russell got on the battlefield at age 13. But she knew all too well because they called him the Demon of Winter. And then David stated that he had already heard rumors that Rubus Russell had become Nishin's fencing teacher. And David was worried about whether he could be a good teacher because he knew nothing about fencing. Ended up a little while later with the girl sitting on the grass waiting for Rubus Russell and thinking about his death in the original story. Because most likely the guy would have died just like the dragonfly that lay in front of her, just as quiet and alone. And Russell was the kind of person who, in case of death, wouldn't even be mentioned, and it seems he was always ready for it. But at that moment, rude as Russell approached her and apologized for being late. But looking over him, Nishina Aaron immediately realized that he was clearly trying not to make eye contact with other people because of his red eyes. But still hers stated that the problem was that she was early, so Russell obviously didn't need to worry. And herself reflected that the more often she saw Rubus Russell in front of her, the more confused she became about which of them was more deserving of compassion. For he was a winter demon who was a master swordsman on the battlefield, and then also the boy who, out of habit, always lowered his eyes, and she really wondered what kind of life he had lived, but realized that they should start by getting closer because he wouldn't say anything. So I was just wondering where they should start the lesson. But he calmly stated that the girl wanted to learn swordsmanship in order to improve her stamina, and she would need strength to hold a sword. So I suggested she start with the easier exercises. She didn't understand why she had to do these exercises, because the exercises were an excuse to get closer to Rubus. But she conceived that if she trained with the best knight, she would become as strong as him, and then she would have a better chance of survival. And then the young man said that in that case, their training today would consist of running 10 laps around the training grounds, and further training would depend on the princess's endurance. And then agreeing, she inquired how she could address the lad, but calmly allowed her to address him by his name, which obviously surprised Nishina, since he was her teacher. She wondered if the guy could look her in the eye when he talked, but he immediately thought that perhaps the princess was uncomfortable looking into his red eyes. But Nishina Aaron calmly convinced him that she thought Rubus Russell's eyes were very beautiful, for they were very much like flowers in the middle of the snow, and admitted that when she first saw Rubus Russell, he was so handsome she couldn't even say a word to him, but he only awkwardly turned away and offered to show her an example of the exercise. And then looking at his confused face while Russell tried to hide it, and Nishina Aaron wondered if the color red really suited him very well. In the end, the training ended like that, and the girl, after 2 laps, was already walking on shaky legs and thinking that if she ran all 10 laps, she would definitely die. Eventually, she showed up for her philosophy class, and then looking around at her disgruntled teachers, Carlos thought that she was very rarely on time, and something must have happened. But she only joked about how she could come later. She'd like to get some rest, since she still wasn't feeling too good after yesterday's workout. As a result, today they had to continue studying the topic of monarchism, which they had not had time to finish in a previous class. And the philosophy teacher explained that sometimes a monarch needed to behave differently than people expected. After all, a strong country needed a strong monarch, and to defend his rule, he had to earn the love of other people. But Nishina Aaron only awkwardly thought that she didn't want to learn that at all, since she didn't even plan on going the way of the hare, and so asked if a monarch needs to possess such qualities as benevolence. But Carlos calmly explained that Nishina Aaron is only supposed to look like that, but isn't, because a monarch didn't need to have mercy and justice. He needed to have calculation and the ability to analyze. And then Nishina Aaron reflected that something like that was absolutely not right for her, and she had just realized that she didn't fit that image, because she's always been taught by Carlos not to sympathize with others and not to forgive so easily. But when she understood the reason for a person's behavior, she just couldn't help but forgive them. And she couldn't hate her brother either, just like she couldn't help but sympathize with Rubus, because in the novel she saw what they were going through. And so she could only wish the two of them happiness. And the more Nishina Aaron learned about the qualities required of a monarch, the more she realized that he didn't fit the role. As a result, a little later, Nishina Aaron was going to practice, and excitedly, Knight Hilton asked her to rest, for she looked like a newborn fawn who was falling down instead of walking around. But she was adamant that she was going to go to practice anyway, and asked that Hilton not worry so much, and reflected that she couldn't waste her precious time. After all, their training was only an hour a day. But besides, she had prepared today. Nishina Aaron ended up showing up to practice a little later, and apologized to Rubus for being late, and casually admitted that she had a hard time walking. But after approaching Rubus, she wondered how long he'd been waiting. But he calmly assured the princess that everything was fine. And Nishina Aaron happily reflected on the fact that Rubus Russell was hardly hiding his eyes today, and he must have really listened to her words. And so she thought she had to do her best today, and suggested she start practicing as soon as possible. Ended up practicing 2 laps around the court, but after recalling Nishin Russell's condition, reduced the run to 1 lap, and asked that Nishina Aaron feel free to tell him if he would run too fast. And the girl just thought about the fact that Rubus Russell, even though he was her teacher, cared for her a lot, and that's why she had to run this lap. But eventually her shoes flew off her feet, sending her to the ground and hitting her face on the grass. And the excited guy running up to her was checking to make sure she wasn't bruised or injured. But Nishina Aaron only thought about the fact that she was very embarrassed. And then the young man looked at her feet and said that she should have worn more comfortable shoes at practice, and realized that she was injured. And then he apologized for his rudeness. And the protagonist looked at him and didn't understand what he was going to do. And then Sir Russell lifted her up in his arms, and the excited princess only begged to be released, for she was very uncomfortable. But approaching Rudis Russell warned that if the princess twitched, she might fall, and asked her to be careful. And then, in spite of her arguments and embarrassment, and Nishina Aaron recognized that she could not walk because of her legs, and Rubis Russell stated that he wanted to carry her to the palace. But at that moment, the heroine remembered what she had brought with her. So she untied the bag and offered Rubis a taste of the cookies she'd made. But I thought he had his hands full, so I just put a cookie in his mouth. But it took her a second to realize she'd crossed the line by being too brazen. As a result, a little later, Joy was healing the princess's legs and was disgruntled to wonder what she was doing if she was able to hurt herself. After which Disgruntled turned to Knight Hilton and wondered how he could even allow the princess to overdo it so much. But he only awkwardly remarked that he was actually trying to stop Nishina. But Joey kept yelling at him and resenting him for not stopping the girl after all. And she awkwardly apologized to the knight. But she thought she and Ruby Russell had gotten a little closer through this training, because the guy had even accepted her cookies, even though it was kind of cheeky of her. And plus today she even got to see the cute side of Rubis Russell, which made her very happy. But seeing what Nishina Aaron was laughing, Joey was very displeased and didn't understand how she could have fun even after hurting herself. And then she strapped it on and found that the wound was aggravated by the uncomfortable shoes, and promised to get her special training shoes ready. But training was to be suspended until the princess was fully recovered and her wound healed. But she excitedly tried to explain that she just had to practice every day. But Joey was undeterred. And then the protagonist was shocked to think that she had only thought she could get close to Rubis, and looking at Sir Hilton asked for his help to stand up for her. But he only looked away awkwardly, and that's when Nishina Aaron realized that it only seemed to be a betrayal. And Joey's displeasure at looking at the princess ordered her to rest. And it seems the protagonist really didn't have a choice. So Nishina Aaron thought about the fact that she wouldn't be able to train, but hoped that she could at least go back to Rubis and personally thank him for the help he'd given her. As a result, a week later, the disgruntled protagonist reflected on the fact that she had indeed been locked up and forbidden to go outside the palace until her leg had fully recovered. And as a result, her training will resume from today, and so she won't be able to thank Rubis Russell until a week later. But she was approached by Melissa, who noticed that Nishina Aaron looked very tired and assumed that the training had been much harder on her than Melissa had bargained for. But Nishina Aaron calmly explained that she really enjoyed practicing, because she knew she definitely couldn't tell her mom that she got injured at the beginning of practice. But Melissa will only reflect that she was very worried about her daughter as she was very busy, but still decided to still come to her for tea party. But an awkward Nishina Aaron stated that it was really nice for her to enjoy a simple tea party with her mom after a long time, especially since the desserts were delicious. And then Melissa noticed that her daughter had recently developed an interest in making desserts, so she made her cupcakes and hoped she would like them. And the awkward protagonist only wondered if those cupcakes were a bribe, but she still wouldn't tell her mom. But when she tasted these cupcakes, she literally couldn't believe it, because they were soft, airy like clouds. And the cream was so sweet and delicate that it melted on her tongue. And it was really an unbeatable flavor. So she thought she should definitely try giving something like that to Rubis, and hoped he would like it. And then looking at her daughter's reaction, Melissa ordered the maid to put some cupcakes with them so her daughter could eat later. And Nishina Aaron was just thinking that her bribe today would be great. At this point, Melissa announced that if these desserts were so much to her daughter's liking, she would like to make them the main dessert at the next tea party, and calmly explained to her surprised daughter that the flowers were blooming very beautifully in the garden, and she needed to mark the beginning of the social season. And then thinking about it, Nishina Aaron realized that she hadn't thought about it at all earlier, because her mother, as well as Nishina Aaron herself, had supporters. And the easiest place to meet them was at the tea party. And of course, it was too early to convince them to join her brother, but she could identify potential allies in advance. And so Nishina Aaron indicated that if it was okay with her mom, she would like to participate in the tea party as well. And Melissa was insanely happy to hear that, for she had long dreamed of being at the tea party with her daughter. And Nishina Aaron only awkwardly thought that she was embarrassed, because her intention to attend the tea party was due to another reason, Yet her mom was still very happy. But she really had no other choice, and so she asked to be told the day of the tea party, and thought that it was the tea party that would start her plan to make a happy ending for herself and her mom. And she'll lay the groundwork to convince the others that her brother is the most suitable candidate for the heir. And the only thing left to do is to improve relations with her brother, and that's what frightened her the most. As a result, while the protagonist was on her way to practice with Joey, an excited maid was worried about her leg. But when the protagonist assured her that everything was fine, Joey noticed that Nishina Aaron looked very depressed. And then she confessed that she wanted a relationship with the man who hates her. But Joey calmly suggested that Nishina should start by showing this man her good side, such as the fact that other people's wounds were more important to her than her own, because such qualities could help someone who didn't tell anyone about their real pain. The awkward girl wondered if she could ease that person's pain in a similar way, but the maid calmly informed that unfortunately, even if Nishina Aaron took his pain for himself, that person's pain would not be reduced. However, he would be able to become less lonely, and Nishina really didn't have to worry, because Joey believed she could do it, and wished her to have a good workout this time and not get hurt. And then the protagonist happily thanked Joey and thought about the fact that although she couldn't help her brother, she could save him from endless loneliness. That's what she thought, but she didn't even expect to meet the prince so quickly. And so when they crossed paths, she asked if he was going to practice, then awkwardly informed him that she had to go that way as well. But the guy was insanely unhappy with her presence, and so was going to just walk past. But Nishina Aaron didn't give up and offered him a little talk, which seemed to piss the guy off even more, because he literally thought his sister was crazy for hitting on him for some unknown reason. And then Nishina Aaron realized that she had read about this episode in the original story, because in the book, it was the moment after which Nishina Aaron never spoke to her brother again. And now that the protagonist was in the original Nishina's shoes, she realized that Nishina Aaron wasn't avoiding Aiden for fear of him hurting her again. Because the problem was that Nishina Aaron didn't want to hurt her brother more. But instead of accepting tragedy in an effort to do no harm, it's much more appropriate to move toward a happy scene even if it hurts. Ended up going through her training, but Nishina Aaron didn't understand why she felt like her heart was about to burst out of her chest. And so she fell to the ground trying to catch her breath. And Rubus Russell, who was concerned about her condition, approached her. And then she awkwardly asked him if they could skip their class today, after which they took a short rest near the tree, and Nishina Aaron happily told what goodies she had brought and wanted to share, and asked Rubus Russell to choose something from what she brought. And then making sure he tasted, and Nishina Aaron finally exhaled a sigh of relief, for she thought Rubus liked her treat. But a surprised and confused Rubus Russell wondered if Nishina Aaron didn't want to eat with him. But she calmly informed him that she'd already eaten earlier, and that she brought these desserts especially for Rubus Russell, and so she asked the guy to take his time. Then watching him, she thought that from the outside the guy looked really cute, and maybe she looked exactly the same from the outside, and that's why her mom liked to feed her so much. Ended up asking Nishina Aaron a little later which of the desserts Rubus liked best, and reflected that he seemed to really like sweets a lot. But it seems that Rubus Russell was very embarrassed and surprised by such an assumption. And Nishina Aaron immediately thought that even the original story never mentioned what exactly Rubus liked. And maybe Rubus Russell just never had a chance to find out. And so she thought that now, instead of bribes, she'd just like to give her precious mentor gifts. And Nishina Aaron would be glad if she also managed to bond with her brother. But at that moment, the butler suddenly came to tell me that he had come to bring glad tidings. Namely, that Emperor Dagon Royce Arthur Whitesnow wishes Nishina Aaron to also attend the regular meetings, and congratulated her on her next step to the throne. In the end, the meeting discussed the fact that the neighboring state has really gone mad, because they demanded that they give them the forest in exchange for the magic stone. But this forest was considered sacred in the empire, for it was a land of spirits that had fully preserved its original form. But if you give up this land as the Wind Empire demanded, then the forest will surely be destroyed like the rest of the foxes that once belonged to them. But simply ignoring their demands would get you nowhere, for where there was no way for spirit spellcasters to go, everything was set in motion with the help of magical stones. And so everyone around them argued that destroying a big forest was really a huge problem, because they had to demand something more in return. But if they didn't give up the forest, then they couldn't avoid armed conflict, and it couldn't be allowed. And no one understood what to do. And Nishina Aaron realized that this problem was quite serious. But there was no point in useless arguments, for this atmosphere of selfishness, greed, and incompetence was really choking her as if she was suffocating. But one man calmly stated that no matter how much they argued, they shouldn't have backed down anyway. But they couldn't go to war because they'd lose a lot. And stated that his family was not afraid of battles and was also not afraid of losing, unlike the Albanian family who never left the capital. Eventually, the argument broke out with renewed vigor, and then watching it, Nishina Aaron thought she really wanted to just scream and stop the argument, and didn't understand how her brother could be so calm about it. But notwithstanding, they were stopped by the Emperor Dakin Royce Arthur Whitesnow, and turning to the Chancellor asked his opinion of the present situation. And he calmly said that if they start a war, they will cause enormous damage to the empire, and then military expenditures will more than double. And if it turns into a full-scale war, the losses will be even greater than the battle on the border 2 years ago. And then Emperor Dakin Royce Arthur Whitesnow asked if they really should have submitted to avoid war. But the Chancellor pointed out that if they handed over the forest as requested, the probability of war in the next 5 years would drop by 30%. But then war would definitely break out in 10 years. And then thinking about it, Nishina Aaron remembered that in the novel, the war started 2 years later, but then the forest still belonged to the Empire, and remembered that in the original story, Nishina Aaron had never left her homeland until the day she died, and she died in those woods. So at least the forest wasn't to be handed over, but everyone around here started arguing about who would take over if war broke out. Whereupon the aristocrats declared that the command of the two heirs could not be trusted, for they were too young. And then Nishina Aaron also entered the conversation, asking for an opportunity to speak, for it was an opportunity to change his brother's image at least a little in the eyes of his father and the aristocrats. So she declared that although she was not yet of age, she was old enough to fulfill her duties as a member of the imperial family, and so she was willing to take responsibility when it was necessary, and stated with a smile that her brother was also ready to do something similar and was thinking exactly the same thing. And so the emperor, turning to the prince, inquired about his opinion, and the lad had no choice. So he calmly confirmed the words to his sister, and the girl was happily reflecting on the fact that earlier in the novel it had been written that Aiden Henry had been forced to go to war, but now the impression of him was bound to change. And still thinking that she'd really like to get close to Avon, but noticing his murderous stare, she immediately thought that maybe she'd done the wrong thing. But at that moment, the aristocrats stated that they didn't expect to be so lucky to have a princess, for she had deep thoughts and displayed the quality of a worthy heir, and stood out on the first day of her presence at the meeting. And then the frightened girl realized that apparently she looked completely different than she had expected, and everyone had the impression that she was in competition with her brother. After which he awkwardly wondered if she was only doing this for Avon's sake, and pondered how to turn the attention of everyone gathered to her brother. But in the end, unexpectedly, Emperor Dakin Royce Arthur Whitesnow announced that their meeting was over for the day, and so a flustered Nishina Aaron realized that if the meeting really ended like this, there would be more misunderstandings between her and her brother. And then he stated that he had previously thought that Nishina Aaron had already realized where she was supposed to be, but judging by her performance today, she couldn't even just shut up, and wondered if she wanted the throne so badly. Eventually, later looking at the nature around her, Nishina Aaron thought that it was indeed a beautiful day to walk under the warm sun and admire the beautiful butterfly flowers. But that made no sense now that she was under the scrutiny of her brother, because she wasn't given even the slightest chance to clear up the misunderstanding and explain that she was only thinking about how to help her brother, and didn't understand what to do now. Rubus Russell eventually came running over to her and bowed down to apologize for being late. And the girl calmly pulled the guy closer to her and fixed his hair and stated that there was nothing wrong with him being late, and he shouldn't have bothered running here because he might hurt himself, which she really didn't want. And herself reflected that Rubus Russell was already very scared, and so she really didn't want him to be in so much pain. And then he saw the scar and wondered how he got it. But at that moment, the awkward Rubus Russell pulled away. And that's when an excited Nishina Aaron realized just how close she was, and realized that she'd been acting like this before, because she'd been helping Sir Hilton all the time, and it was her habit. And so she awkwardly reflected that after the meeting she couldn't sleep due to excitement, And so she made a mistake and awkwardly apologized for touching him without even warning him. But when she looked at Rubus Russell's face, she noticed how embarrassed he was and thought he was insanely cute. But after forcing herself to focus and stating that Rubus Russell had another practice later, and so asked to start their practice early. But he calmly indicated that he would like to let the girl rest a little, for she looked tired. And then Nishina Aaron happily wondered if she had really just been asked to skip practice. And so she took a dessert out of her basket and offered to start training after Ruby Russell had tasted the dessert. And since she had already eaten, she would just rest. After which Nishina Aaron reflected that every time she sees Rubus Russell eating, she thinks he's really cute, because it's at times like this that this guy looks his age, although he had a hard fate because he started killing at a very young age. And he was even younger than he is now, because a 13-year-old boy wielded a ball the size of himself and fought to keep from breaking under the oppression of war. And so she stated that only 2 years ago, Rubus Russell had been in the war, but he only awkwardly confirmed her words. And an embarrassed Nishina Aaron reflected that she didn't want to voice it at all, because it was obvious that Rubus Russell didn't have any good memories from the war, so she was very embarrassed. But she did admit that she wanted to ask about something, because during the conflict, the Wind Empire had said it had nothing to do with the looters on the border and claimed they were hungry people. But Rubus Russell reported that most of these men were well-trained, and heard Nishin's reply, Aaron wondered if she had expected anything like this, for it was obvious that soldiers had been sent to the border. But hearing it from eyewitnesses was much harder, because after all, ordinary people couldn't fight the Empire for so long. But at this point, Rubus Russell admitted that among the attackers were also ordinary people who had become marauders because of hunger. And so she asked Rubus Russell if the battle had been agonizing, but awkwardly apologized, thinking it was a stupid question since the answer was already obvious. But Rubus Russell admitted that in those days soldiers clearly suffered, but constantly claimed to be proud to protect their loved ones. And then Nishina Aaron wondered if Rubus Russell had convinced her that these were unintentional victims and was apparently trying to comfort her. But she knew that all those sacrifices were made for those in power, and so she wanted to do everything she could to make sure those sacrifices weren't in vain, and pondered that she would soon find a way and wanted to rest a while until Ruby Russell had finished. But the next moment, as soon as she closed her eyes, she found herself in a very dark place and wondered if this was the first time she had ever been here. But the next moment she saw the doors, and there was a knock from the knight, who reported that he had brought the necessary man, and the unknown fellow invited him to enter. And then Nishina Aaron, shocked by what she saw, realized that it was Rubus Russell who was now that knight, who greeted the prince and introduced himself. And then looking at him, Aiden stated that the rumors that Rubus Russell had the eyes of a monster were just lies, because he had normal eyes. Whereupon Rubus Russell Aiden Heinrich stated that if Rubus Russell no longer had a reason to exist, then he could have given his worthless life in his hand, and he'd agreed. And then the princess, shocked by this, could not believe if this was the future she had read about in the novel. And then she realized that these were the very events she was obligated to prevent. And the prince calmly ordered Rubus to stay in the vanguard for him to go to the emperor, and he calmly agreed to carry out the order. And then looking at all the destruction around her that flashed before her eyes, Nishina Aaron realized that this was the future that could not be allowed to happen. Afterwards, she saw a picture of a servant reporting to Aiden about Rubus Russell dying during this battle, and he didn't even seem to be upset about something like that. But looking at it, Nishina Aaron realized how much of a nightmare it was. But the next moment her eyes opened and she saw the hands of a guy who was gently trying to bring her to her senses and asking if she was okay. But the next moment she was approaching Rubus, wondering why his ears and hair were now so intensely red. But the next moment, thinking about her words, she realized that the sun was already setting, and so she was literally in shock, not understanding if she had slept through the whole thing. After all, she was supposed to have a history class in the afternoon. And then I remembered that Rubus Russell had a practice scheduled for this afternoon, and apparently he was late, and stated that he clearly should have woken him up. But Rubus Russell calmly explained that she wanted to take Nishina to the palace, but he couldn't touch her without permission and apologized for something like that. And awkward, and Nishina Aaron felt a tremendous amount of guilt, for she knew how important training was to the knight. And because of her, Rubus Russell had missed training even without warning, and thought about the fact that the knight's requirements for students were especially strict, and realized that Rubus Russell was obviously angry with his teacher. So she was determined to go with Rubus and explain everything. But at this point, the guy calmly assured her that it wasn't necessary, since the prince's rest was far more important than his training. And the maddeningly displaced girl didn't understand the reason this guy was so kind. But she asked Rubus Russell to warn him that this tardiness was because of her. But later, she reflected that even though Rubus Russell had agreed to tell the real reason for being late, she would certainly not do so. And if Rubus Russell is severely punished because of her, he will obviously become distant. And then, noticing Nishina Aaron's condition, the servants would get agitated and ask if she was all right and suggest they call a doctor. But she only awkwardly admitted that she didn't really have an appetite. And then the maids wondered if it was probably due to hard training. So determined to prepare a hot bath and warm milk to relieve the fatigue. And Nishina Aaron, trying to stop them, pondered that she had slept through the entire training session. And she now needed a magical tool that would rewind time back you. But in the end, the maids were in such a hurry that they pushed the incoming Knight Hilton and ordered him out of the way. And he fell to the ground from such a surprise. And looking at this picture, Nishina Aaron thought that in fact her maids were unusually strong that she did not even know about. But afterward remembered that Sir Hilton was now coming in from the practice field, and so excitedly inquired if he had seen Rubus Russell there, and explained that he was absent today. But he was at afternoon practice and admitted that it was about her. And then Knight admitted that he also thought the absence of Rubus Russell was strange because he had never missed training before. And the girl only asked if Rubus Russell had been punished. But he calmly explained that another knight was in charge of the punishment. And then Nishina Aaron, madly displeased, stated that Sir Hilton had simply had to interfere, and wondered what she should do, and literally couldn't believe that because of such a mistake their relationship would come to an end. And now everything would be just like she had seen in her nightmare. But at this point, Sir Hilton explained that the princess need not have worried, for Rubus Russell had not been punished much, and all he had to do was run 30 laps around the training ground, and he didn't even consider it a punishment. But frightened Nishina Aaron, remembering her condition after 2 laps, realized that it was indeed a nightmare, especially since because of such punishment, Rubus Russell could even be deprived of dinner. And so excitedly, the girl asked if Rubus Russell had already completed her punishment. But Hilton calmly explained that while he was on his way here, Rubus Russell had already completed the 25th lap, and if he wasn't hurt, he'd be fine, and he should be done by now. But a worried Nishina Aaron wondered what he meant about Rubus Russell possibly being hurt. And Hilton calmly explained that if the physical strength runs out, then Rubus could have just collapsed from overexertion. However, he is a true monster, so the princess had nothing to worry about. And then she was adamant that she had to go see Rubus Russell right away. And then she remembered what Carlos was always saying to her philosophy teacher, because he had explained to her that a monarch should not apologize to others for every mistake and bow his head to his subordinates. But Nishina Aaron had never been a monarch, and she didn't see Rubus Russell as a subordinate or beneath her. And so she vowed her sincere apologies for the punishment he had to endure, and reflected that power should never be more important than life. And she thought about the fact that she wanted to apologize yesterday, but because Hilton was so concerned, he stopped her. But at this point, no less disturbed by such behavior, Rubus Russell awkwardly explained that the princess clearly shouldn't be apologizing to him over something like this. And she didn't understand why this guy had been so kind to her, and she thought that earlier she had wanted to apologize to Rubus on her knees. But then he would have been even more confused, so she changed her tactics. And after looking the guy over, she asked if he was sure he wasn't hurt. But he only awkwardly looked away and assured her he was fine. But Nishina Aaron remembered well what Knight Hilton had said about Rubus Russell falling and hurting himself. And so now his wounds could be hidden under his clothes. And so she asked that Rubus Russell sit down for a while, after which she apologized to the front and took off his shoes and ordered him to sit still. Then she peeled off his pant leg and saw that there was a wound there and couldn't believe that he really thought he was okay, because the wound was very serious and could probably hurt a lot. But Rubus Russell Woods awkwardly stated that it was no big deal because his wound would heal on its own after a while. But Nishina Aaron was adamant, so she opened the ointment she had prepared in advance and stated that a scar would appear at the site of such a wound, and asked if Russell was ready to take responsibility for it. And Rubus Russell but only guiltily apologized, which made Nishina Aaron even more restless. After which she gently treated the boy's wound and stated that he really should have told her that he was late because of her, because he had promised to do so earlier. But Rubus Russell only calmly assured her that there was really no need for it, for the punishment was not too severe. But displeased Nishina Aaron did not understand for what reason Rubus Russell was so kind, and was very angry that he had been punished on principle, for everybody around knew that the fellow was not the sort of person to be late without reason. and thought she should do something similar to Sir Richard's leg, who had punished him. But from such a suggestion, Rubus Russell only laughed and again informed the princess that he was really all right. But at that moment, the girl suddenly had a severe heartache, and frightened by this, Rubus Russell at once rose and inquired if she was ill. But Nishina Aaron admitted that really her heart just couldn't take it because Rubus Russell was smiling too beautifully. Then, looking at his face, she immediately realized that she had embarrassed this guy, and he had such a sweet demeanor that she couldn't even imagine in the original story. Because the original said that no one had ever seen Rubus Russell smile before, but it turns out he could do it, and he was very handsome. And the next moment, she thought that maybe she was the only person she'd ever seen him like that, and frantically reflected that she was glad to be the only one. But she felt madly sorry for Rubus Russell, for he was still regarded as a knight without emotion, but admitted that she was very selfish if she still wanted to be special to Rubus Russell. But as he approached her, the concerned guy asked what was going on with Nishina, because she looked like something was bothering her. And then she couldn't bear to admit that it was all Rubus Russell's fault, because he was too nice, and also very fair and sincere. But then the awkward knight reminded the protagonist that she was still holding his hand. But Nishina Aaron gave him a condition that she would let go of his hand if he promised to smile every so often in the future. And after he made that promise, she kept her end of the bargain. Eventually, a little while later, and Nishina Aaron found herself in her room, and looking around at the maids, wondering where the things she had previously asked them to bring were. And when a huge stack of letters from Nishina Aaron appeared in front of her, it was time to suffer, because this stack was entirely made up of invitations to the banquet. Then she asked how many invitations had come in a month, and the maid explained that she had chosen only the invitations that the girls had sent before the coming-of-age ceremony. And then Nishina Aaron asked that Alice choose 2 kinds of paper and bring it to her, because she wanted to use different kinds for the rejection and for the invitation to the tea party. And then when the maid came out, Joey noticed that Nishina Aaron was a little confused, even though she wasn't obligated to do such a thing until her coming-of-age ceremony. But she still decided to have her tea party. And then she awkwardly thought about the fact that earlier she had not even suspected that something like this could happen. And Hilton only happily noted that their princess has grown up very quickly and decided to organize her own tea party. At this point, Nishina Aaron remembered that her mom had recommended that she have a tea party with young ladies her age before meeting the older ladies. And though she knew her mother was worried, given her lack of social experience, she didn't want to have this tea party anyway, because it was too burdensome for her. But nevertheless, even this tea party could change her future, so she was determined. And then Joey and Hilton remarked that those invited to this tea party would be greatly honored, for it was the first tea party in the princess's life. And then the knight asked how many people she planned to invite for her first tea party, and Nishina Aaron admitted that she wanted to start with 4 people, because it was the first time she organized such an event. After that, Hilton asked if Nishina Aaron had already thought of who she wanted to invite from the guests. And then she thought about the fact that because of her excitement, she had stayed up all night and looked through all kinds of documents in order to choose the best candidates, and remembered that in their empire, only the most outstanding person can become the heir of the family, and gender and seniority have no influence on it. And despite the fact that the lady who wanted to call and the protagonist had nothing to do with politics, they also had every chance to become the head of their families. So it was necessary to choose the most capable. And at Melissa Nishina's tea party, Aaron must find the necessary allies. And at her tea parties, Aaron must provide his brother with new forces to support him in the future. And so the girl was determined to put her plan into action. And just at that moment, the maid came, bringing all the necessary paper for the letters, and then thanked her, and the protagonist warned that as soon as she finished with the letters, she would need to go somewhere, and invited her to go with her. And she herself thought that she just needed to make a good gift for her mentor. As a result, a little while later, Nishina Aaron went to the kitchen and did the cooking, and the excited maid asked that the job be handed over to her, as the princess had no need to do something like that. But Nishina Aaron was adamant, for she knew that there was no point in treats that she had not made herself. For Rubus Russell had been punished and even injured because of her, and such a thing could not be forgiven just because she had given him dessert. So she simply had to make them personally. And then, realizing Nishina's motivation, the girl decided to help her and explained that the main character was doing a little wrong, and the dough should not be beaten and should be carefully mixed. And so when the girl told also should by example how to do it correctly, she came out a delicious dough, which was madly surprised by the princess, and wondered where Alice had learned it. But she calmly explained that she had never learned anything like that, It was just that her family was poor, and so even though she was an aristocrat, if she hadn't learned to cook, they wouldn't have had anything to eat. And then thinking about it, Lizaveta realized that Alice had mentioned earlier that she was from a poor family. But she had the impression that most of the girl's salary went to her family in another country. And so she thought that maybe she should hire the girl as a pastry chef in order to raise her salary. But perhaps it would be too burdensome for her. At this point, Alice calmly announced that she was glad to be able to help Nishina, and she would like to do her best to help it be helpful in the future as well. And then thinking, and Lizaveta asked if they could also make non-sweet cookies together, and explained that she would like to give those cookies to her brother. And Alice cheerfully announced that this would be no problem, and she would be happy to suggest a delicious recipe for the main character. But in the end, after a while, looking at what they got, the protagonist thought that maybe it wasn't so terrible, and asked the chef for his opinion. And then he was about to confess that it really didn't look very good, and the cookies were hardly edible. But one murderous look ordered the man to watch his words. So he informed the princess that her work really wasn't bad. And then she literally glowed and decided to try making cookies next time as well. Alice happily explained that the next cookie would take less time, and the result would be much better. But after the main character had already put all the cookies in a bag to go to her brother, the maid expressed her hopes that Nishina Aaron would be able to convey her feelings with the cookies. In the end, a little later, his assistant knocked on the prince's room to warn him that he had a visitor. And then the protagonist came out to apologize for interrupting. And holding out the baggie admitted that she had made the cookies especially for her brother, and they weren't sweet, so he should like them. But the guy only grudgingly wondered if the main character had brought in cookies because she'd added something to them. And then she was shocked, not realizing that her brother really suspected her of poisoning her. For of course, she knew that her brother would not be happy to see her. But she really could not have foreseen such an accusation. And I didn't understand what it was all about. And if it was because the Empress was dead and all the vassals had turned their backs on the young man, and so he thought her very existence threatened him, or he just hated her enough to question everything she did. And then the prince turned to Oscar and asked him to escort his sister and warned him not to let anyone else in without his permission. And then Nishina Aaron reflected that she was willing to suffer in order to understand her brother. But that didn't mean she wasn't completely resentful of him. Because if it had already happened that way, there was no need to create happy memories with her. And he shouldn't have been so affectionate and caring towards her as a child, because he shouldn't have become important to her from the beginning. So she asked Oscar to wait and warned her brother that it would only take a few minutes to talk. And walking over to her brother, she took out a cookie and explained that she wanted to settle the misunderstanding now, and calmly ate it and asked if Aiden could taste her cookie after she proved that it wasn't poisoned, and looked him over and apologized for interrupting, and then she was leaving. But with one last look back, she thought to herself that he would probably Aiden throw away the cookies she made. But there was nothing she could do about it anyway, especially since she just wanted to give him something. So it was okay, even if he didn't taste it. In the end, while they were walking, Oscar apologized for his insolence and gave the girl advice that if she really cared about her brother, she shouldn't have gotten closer to him because he had already experienced enough pain and suffering. But to Oscar's surprise, he wasn't scolded, and Nishina Aaron calmly thanked him for being so loyal to his brother, but warned him that she couldn't fulfill his request, and confessed that she really wanted to get closer to her brother again, as she had before. Then she said goodbye because she was late for class and left. And then an awkward Oscar reflected that it was likely that Nishina was probably going through a lot, just like his master, and in that they were very much alike. Finally walking to the training ground at this time, Nishina Aaron was pondering what to do if Rubus Russell still refused to accept her cookies, because earlier she was sure that everything looked fine. But remembering what she'd actually cooked, she thought she'd just thrown them away. But Rubus Russell wasn't the kind of man who would openly express his displeasure, but something like this could embarrass him. And so she thought it would be better to eat the failed cookie herself and make him a new one. And she probably should have asked a pastry chef, and then it would have been delicious. But at that moment, while she was deep in her reflections, Rubus Russell suddenly came up to her and greeted the princess, causing her to be very frightened. Then he noticed the baggie that had fallen out. And then the protagonist realized that now she would definitely have to throw the cookies away. But he only awkwardly wondered if they were the cookies she had made. But the next moment she took the cookies away fearfully and told Rubus that the cookies weren't made for him, for he didn't know any other way to convince the guy not to eat them. But afterwards, she awkwardly realized how stupid her behavior had been, because after something like this, there could be a huge misunderstanding between them that she wanted to avoid. And so she admitted that she had actually made these cookies to give to Rubus. But since it was the first time she had made them, the shape and taste were strange. But at that moment, the confused boy asked if the cookies had been made especially for him. And Nishina Aaron admitted that Rubus Russell had recently been punished and hurt because of her. So she should have just asked the pastry chef to cook something. Because she had cooked it herself, it didn't work out. But she asked Rubus Russell to tell her exactly what he wanted to eat. But instead of asking for anything, he just held out his hands to the main character, asking her to give him the cookies that had been made for him. But she just awkwardly yelled that what she had made was inedible. But looking at Rubus' awkward face, she couldn't stand it and gave him the cookies, stating that she was going to give those cookies to him anyway from the beginning. But the next second, she realized that because of his awkward face, she had given a cookie she didn't want to give. But it would be rude of her to ask him back, because then there would be more misunderstandings between them and the situation would get worse. So looking at Rubus, she asked him not to force himself to eat the cookies if he didn't like them. But the guy informed with a smile that Nishina shouldn't worry so much because the cookies were really good. And then looking at him, the girl thought that she felt strange, for though she was not sure that Rubus Russell would not kill her in the future. Yet the more she was near him, the faster her vigilance weakened, and he even stopped her consolation. But the next moment, she noticed that a leaf had landed on the guy's head, tangled in his hair and not about to fly away. And so she wondered if she could put it away, but then immediately reached into his hair to shake the flyer. But at once realized that it was very rude of her, and so she shivered and tried to justify herself to Rubus, and confessed that the fellow was so handsome that even the leaf did not want to detach itself from the young man's hair, and explained that she was just going to brush it off. But the embarrassed guy fixing his hair calmly reassured Nishina that everything was fine. And she wondered if Rubus Russell had already convinced her as many as 2 times today that he was fine. But it would be better if he told her the truth instead of lying. But afterwards, she thought about the fact that maybe everything really was okay. And so she wondered if she could touch Rubus' hair a little more. And surprisingly, he agreed. And so she gently reached out and began to run her hand through his soft silver hair, thinking that at that moment, it was as if all her difficulties were disappearing. Then she began to think about the fact that this method of stress relief seemed to have a name she couldn't remember. But then she realized it was called animal therapy, or so-called healing. And so she thought Ruby Russell was perfect for the role of the cute rabbit. But at that moment, the guy noticed that Nishina Aaron was obviously worried about something, and she confessed that something very depressing had happened to her today. But Rubus was making her feel a lot better, so she asked if she could also touch the guy's hair a little after the workout. And he gave his consent, albeit with great embarrassment. In the end, after a while, the maids dressed the protagonist in suitable clothes and convinced her that she really did not have to worry about anything, because although she had always been beautiful, but today her beauty was especially dazzling. But she only grudgingly didn't understand what was so special about this tea party if everyone around her was so excited about the event. Then looking over her maids, she wondered if they were really crying because today was her first tea party, and thought they were really excited. But at that moment, Hilton spoke.